when you have 5 minutes remaining, 3 minutes remaining, and 1 minute remaining if necessary. Because we have such a large number, we have reduced and changed the way the peer reviews are done. So look in the email that Beth sent and review 4 students ahead of you and 4 students after when you present, so that you peer review 8 students in total. If you for anyone who joined late, you probably can't see some of the information in the group chat. There's a link in there for the peer review feedback. I will post that again in a minute. What else? I think that's about it. Julio, whenever you're ready, I'll start the timer.
Well, yeah, ready.
Okay, go for it.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Really happy to be here with you today with the peer review of my proposal, Geodesign Approach to Community Planning in Barrio Venezuela in Puerto Rico. So what is geodesign? Geodesign is a framework that aims to tackle complex and significant design problems that have a geographical nature at a geographical level. It requires collaboration as a central principle. Stakeholders, or the people of the place in geodesign studies, are for whom geodesign studies are undertaken. So they're the main client or main reason we undertake geodesign studies. Stakeholders of the people or the people of the place establish the values, propose changes, and make the final decision towards the acceptance of a geodesign study. So that's really important. Our stakeholders in Barrio Venezuela are the people of the place, which are community that want a better quality of life. Also, we have government entities like the local municipality of San Juan, the territorial government of Puerto Rico and its planning institutions. And also in the case of Rio Piedras, we have a community board and a development trust. The big brother in this whole geography is the University of Puerto Rico, and you'll see why later in the presentation. These actors have, or stakeholders have, different influence in the planning process. Maybe I was a bit cynical in their positions, as you can see, with the municipality and the local government. But their position is strong because they have the resources and the organizations to drive planning, while the community groups and other smaller institutions or the people of the place don't have those resources. So their influence is less, is a weak influence in the process. Also at the center of the geodesign study are questions, or the main methodology that we're going to follow. These questions are how the area should be described, and that translate to a model, which is representation, how the study area operates, which is a process model. We ask ourselves, is the area working well, and work with that in an evaluation model. How can the area be altered, and that's a change model. The differences or the impacts these alterations, these changes could implicate, and that's an impact model. And lastly, should the area be changed, and that's a decision model. At the end, the decision is the community's work to ratify, ask for changes, or reject geodesign proposals. And these questions are made in 3 iterations, where we explore or understand the study area, decide on the methods on the second iteration, and then perform the study, which goes to the stakeholders for decision. The framework also works with systems. So this evaluation, change, impacts, and decisions will be, in our case, around 8 systems. And these systems are housing, transportation, energy, water, and green infrastructure, institutional, which are schools, hospitals, clinics, etc., agriculture, commerce, and industry. So, about our area of interest of Barrio Venezuela, and the first question of how is the area represented. Barrio Venezuela is located in Rio Piedras, which is a ward, a barrio. We inherited that form of organization from our Spanish colonizers. So that's why a barrio is a ward, bureau, borough. In English, they have different definitions, but it's a sub-administrative region within a municipality or a city. So Barrio Venezuela is if you look it up in the census, it's a sub-administrative region. So Puerto Rico is the only census geography that has sub-barrios, which is interesting. But Barrio Venezuela is part of the Rio Piedras ward of San Juan, and San Juan is the capital of the U.S. territory of Puerto Rico. Venezuela was first established around 1910 as an informal workers' settlement. Workers came in from the countryside to work in San Juan, well, in that case, still the Rio Piedras municipality. And we had one activity that attracted people, and was the foundation and construction of a new university. It extends approximately for 40 acres. At its highest elevation point is 180 feet. Over the years, the community has formalized their residences and the location by upgrading the structure, and also the government has provided services and infrastructure. So here is a general location of where we're talking about. So we're here in Puerto Rico in the Caribbean, in the smallest of the greater Antilles of Cuba, Española, and then Puerto Rico. And we're in the northeast coast of the island, and in the center, almost center of the capital city of San Juan. And you'll see then there at the right, Barrio Venezuela, which is a small community enclave between, at the north, the urban center of Rio Piedras. And when I say urban center, also Spanish territorial organization, while in the US you have a main street, and the main street is the center hub of commercial activity. Here and in other Latin American countries, we have the plaza, and the plaza was the center activity, was where the church was or is, where the ayuntamiento or the mayor's office is, and where the commercial activity is. So Rio Piedras was a former municipality. It has its own plaza, and Barrio Venezuela was next to that activity. So we have the University of Puerto Rico, and you'll see that the community is surrounded by institutional land uses, from the UPR Agriculture Experimental Station to the west, to the south with the Botanical Gardens and the Central Administration's Office, and to the north with Rio Piedras and the main campus of the University of Puerto Rico. So you'll see in 1936, these were the first aerial images taken of Puerto Rico. You'll see Barrio Venezuela was located in the countryside, along with Rio Piedras, that received goods from southern parts of the island. You'll see the university to your left, and how it was starting to grow in its footprint. And basically all these fields you see to the south are mainly sugarcane and other agricultural products. 1936, very, very rural. And now you see in 2010 how that all changes. Basically, the community was connected to the urban center and other activities, and now is an enclave surrounded by roads, the viaduct from the Puerto Rico San Juan Metro, and a small bridge, pedestrian bridge, connects Venezuela to where the activities are present. So that's a big problem. So process models. what's wrong with Venezuela? The growth in economic activity attracted people to Venezuela, but that growth ended sometimes in the 1990s. And it ended because of changing economic conditions like globalization, the end of economic tax incentives provided by federal law, and values change also from people. People started moving to suburbs, and that's a phenomenon also that happened in the US. Population change. Puerto Rico had a great population boom in the 40s. It continued till the 1980s. But in the 90s, it started, after the 90s, it started to decline. So you'll have then that this growth of rate started to slow down. And you'll see that now we're at a negative rate of population. So people are emigrating from the island. And in Venezuela, it has not been the exception. And it's really poignant with that 19% of population decrease or change. But Venezuela reflects a pattern that is happening along all Puerto Rico. And you have a loss of 31% between 2010 and the estimates for 2017. That population decrease affects housing. So less people occupying housing. So you'll see how that rate has been moving the tendency to lower growth rate. But in Barrio Venezuela, the occupancy started to go in negative levels in 2010. So occupancy is shrinking, more housing is vacant. And this map shows where the vacant housing is more prevalent. You'll see areas in red, which are areas with 44% or less vacant housing. And basically in an area of 40 acres, that number is quite high. So when it's a small area with high number of vacancy units, that creates a real sense of abandonment and difficulty for communities. So for 2017, we had 211 vacant homes or housing units, and that represented 30% of housing units, which is a lot. So if that was enough, we had a big hurricane in 2017 that hit hard communities like Barrio Venezuela, where homes are a mix of construction materials. So we had that 85 homes were severely damaged or completely destroyed in this small area. So how do we evaluate our framework? An evaluation model will serve as a guide to locate the best areas for new development or new activities in the area of interest. The evaluation of the study's 8 systems will follow a 5 criteria scale to determine the geographical suitability within the area of interest. So we have a small table as an example for housing, the housing system. So we are ranking the alternatives that we come up with. In our example, feasible areas would be areas with housing vacancy of more than 40%, with poor existing conditions on those housings and excellent accessibility to transport and areas of no risk. And we'll go then to the other side of the spectrum, which is areas with low vacancy and good housing conditions. Accessibility could be limited, and they could be in high slopes or in flood-prone areas. So we're basically doing a suitability model for each of our 8 systems, with feasible areas being the most desired for change because they're deteriorated or they present things that we want to change. And not appropriate are areas that are working well or are areas that have impediments for that activity. In red, you see existing areas that are areas that we want to leave the same and we don't want to change. Changes in the area of interest are driven again by people of the place. And they'll make the suggestions or the proposals within the geodesign model. These proposals could look like a demolition of vacant, deteriorated structures, or repurposing of lots into activities for other systems, the development of new housing units in new vacant lots. In terms of green infrastructure, is the repurposing could be a proposal, the repurposing of vacant lots into green infrastructure like parks and community gardens, and also the development of rooftop gardens to collect water and reduce the heat effect in the community. Energy infrastructure also could be part of the proposals with the development of energy infrastructure on rooftops or in vacant lots. So these changes will have impacts. Every time we change something, we have an impact on other systems. So the impact model and the geodesign study are used to establish metrics and assess the benefits or cost of proposed changes. These impacts can vary from study to study, but include some of the following areas. These impacts could be programmatic, can be also in the function of different systems. It could be changes of organizational nature of how things or institutions need to work. They could also be in economics, environmental, social, cultural, or legal frameworks. So geodesign not only proposes change to the geography of the place, there's also policies that coincide or are reflected in the geographical aspect. One example is low regulations about luminic, losing my word in English, contamination, light contamination or light pollution, that's the word. So that is a policy that is written in a law, but it has a geographical nature. The enforcement has. So again, we're ranking those impacts on a simple scale, most positive to negative, most positive to most negative. So those impacts will be measured in that way. So what are the outcomes, or what are we hoping to achieve with the geodesign study? So we want to identify change of areas where physical and decline or other conditions make it unsuitable for housing. So these are areas where there's high rate of abandonment or areas where housing conditions are not adequate. Again, this is informal settlement, that it's old, but that doesn't mean that it does not have characteristics of decline in their housing. There's a phenomenon called self-building. So people are really resilient and they build their own houses and they modify their own houses. And that's good because it gives them a sense of ownership that is stronger than in a suburb. But also if people don't have resources to keep up with their maintenance or the changes in their housing, that's gonna affect the quality of living. So we're looking of areas of abandonment and not low quality areas to be intervened. identifying and changes areas where physical decline conditions make it possible for new housing and new activities to be established. And we want to identify and change areas for physical connectivity between residents and the area of economic and ecosystem services. So as you saw in the beginning, we have an enclave community that needs connectivity to services, economic activities, and also to green infrastructure. Green open spaces are really important for the well-being of communities. Also, we want to capture people's vision of the place, about how they see these new configurations in their community. We want to develop projects and policy proposals that come from that local knowledge, which is really important to capture. And we want to build consensus. That's really also a main objective. Lastly, I think this slide, I'm going to go over it real quick, but it gives us a perspective on how geodesign differs from comprehensive planning or planning frameworks that we've been used to in the past. So there's lack of updating and a fast obsolescence of plans. So geodesign tries to work with that, while allowing for simultaneous work. There's standardized methodologies in geodesign also and in planning, but geodesign is more adapted according to reality of the place. And also, real quick, so you can ask questions, planning is product oriented. And the plan is the end of the process, while geodesign is an open process that iterates to get a decision from stakeholders. And it's also more transparent and more democratic. So with 3 minutes, I guess, remaining, would be great to hear your questions.
Questions?
Yes, the geography is it's not too steep, but when we have water shortages, it's on high area within the city. So Venezuela is one of the first areas where water service are affected. Also, the runoffs are really a problem. So we are in a tropical island. Right now we're leaving our dry season. So the first week of May we have showers every day. So runoffs are a problem. So that's why green roofs and other green infrastructure could help the area work with water management. And since it's a built-up area, water carries all those contaminants from cars and other products that run off with within the drainage system. Any other questions? Yes. So right now, it's interesting because there's a framework within Rio Piedras, which Venezuela is a part of Rio Piedras, that established land trust, but the land trust needs to acquire those vacant structures and implement a plan or projects to renovate, repurpose those vacant structures. At the government level, there is no plan. And we're inserted right now in the recovery phase of the impact of Hurricane Maria, and the CDBG-DR, or Community Development Block Grants disaster recovery projects, are really fuzzy on specifics. So we have lost so much population in the past years after the economic downturn and after the hit of Irma and Maria in 2017, that the problem hasn't been studied well, and the interventions the planning is just starting. So I think my time's up. So thank you very much, everyone, for your attention and your great questions.
I think you have one more question there from.
Oh,
do you want to just answer that one?
Yes, I'm familiar with the area because I live there. I live in the urban center of Rio Piedras, and I'm part of one of the community groups. I'm also an urban planner, so I think my approach to geodesign was because I feel that community oriented planning is not something that comprehensive or planners do well, because our practice from the private sector or the governmental sector it's really geared towards the technical. So we need to start collaborating with communities before presenting plans, because that's what makes them obsolete after a short period of time. We don't have that critical mass that comes from people wanting or lobbying for those interventions. So the collaboration approach, I think, is essential in moving things forward, and also to create consensus. Also, technically, we can go with proposals to the community, but not understanding their context and their cells of ownership is also something we need to learn more of.
Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Good luck with the rest of your project.
Thank you.
Okay, our next presenter is Delphine. If you can load up your presentation, please.
Does that work?
Yes.
Okay, and you can hear me, right?
Yes.
Wonderful. Okay. So I'm not seeing the chat though. Is that normal? I can do it out, but it's just.
Yes. So if you put your cursor at the bottom, can you see the different things at the bottom, like chat?
No, it's like the presentation has taken over.
Okay, that's okay. I can do a little dingly sound when you have 5 minutes left. Okay?
All right.
Okay, go for it.
All right. Hi, everyone. So I am Delphine Cana, and the name of my capstone project is Unlocking Troves of Data, Feature Extraction from Historical Print Maps through an Object-Based Classification Approach. Okay, so, sorry. So the outline of my presentation today is the following. First, I will talk about the background of my project, and then I will talk about goals, project methodology, proposed timeline, and anticipated results outcome, as well as further developments. So starting with the background, first we'll talk about historical geospatial data. So GIS analysts are used to accessing geospatial data sets from multiple sources, such as federal and local governments, private companies, and nonprofits. However, most of that data is relatively recent, from the last 20 to 30 years. So what happens when someone needs access to older historical data? There might be different reasons for needing to use geospatial data from previous historical periods. For instance, a researcher studying a past phenomenon or interested in the evolution of specific geographic features over time. This might occur in fields like history, archaeology, but also demography, urban studies, environmental studies, etc. Also, increasingly, we need historical data as input for computational models and machine learning algorithms. And this often requires, those models require a large amount of past data in order to predict future trends. Historical print maps are great sources of data about the past. They contain a wealth of information about the topography, land cover, urban development, human demographics, environmental dynamics, and more. They represent facts from the 18th to 20th century, or even earlier. However, that data is locked on paper and cannot be leveraged easily in GIS systems. So we'll now talk about feature extraction. So how do we extract that data? Traditionally, this has been done through manual feature extraction, where the features of interest are digitized using tablets or heads-up digitization techniques. It works, but it is very expensive and slow. For the last 15 years or so, some researchers have also been experimenting with automated or semi-automated feature extraction. The different approaches have been proposed, and I will briefly mention some of them. So in all cases, we first start with a raster image that is obtained by scanning the historical print map, georeferencing it, and cropping it. Some pre-processing steps are then often applied, for instance, to standardize the brightness level or limit the number of colors. So one method is the pixel level classification. It uses supervised or unsupervised classification algorithms to assign each raster cell to one of several classes. That approach is good for extracting relatively simple hue-based aerial symbologies like forested areas in the example shown here. The template-based method relies on the representation of a symbol, and it seeks to retrieve that shape, that pattern, in a sliding window all over the map. That approach is good for individual symbols, for example, the quarry symbol shown here. More recently, machine learning techniques have emerged. They rely on training a neural network to recognize a specific feature, such as individual black squares representing buildings, like in this example. This is a promising approach. However, it requires the use of very large training samples, which are not always easy to secure with historical maps. Finally, object-based image analysis, or OBA, is a method that is used a lot in remote sensing image analysis. And I found a few examples where it was applied to historical map feature extraction. In that approach, the map is segmented into objects made of pixels that are adjacent and share similar characteristics. Then the classification is done at the object level using a series of classification rules that can use contextual information about the objects. That method is quite versatile, and it has the potential to identify a variety of symbologies. Also, it does not require any training samples. This is the method that I will be focusing in this capstone project. Oh, is it okay? Can you hear me still okay?
Yes, yes, we can. Keep going.
All right. Okay, so last part of the background, I will be talking briefly about Soviet military maps. Automating extraction is particularly interesting with large map series. Putting a feature extraction workflow in place is time-consuming regardless of the method chosen. So ideally, you want to use that workflow many times on many different geographic areas. Soviet military maps are a fascinating example of large map series. And my project will focus on some of those maps. So Soviet military maps were produced in the Soviet Union for most of the 20th century. Those maps were usually highly classified and unknown to the public. The Soviet army first focused on mapping Russia and the countries surrounding it, and later on, after World War II, they went on to map most of the terrestrial Earth surface in the context of the Cold War especially. For instance, here you can see the details of a map of Washington, D.C. Several series exist at different scales and from different years. And large-scale series use the exact same symbology consistently, which is great from a feature extraction standpoint. After the collapse of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s, more and more of those maps started appearing in the West. Thousands of map sheets have already surfaced, and it is suspected that there exist many more that are still unknown to us. That cartographic body represents a wealth of valuable historical information, and those maps are known in particular for their remarkable level of details. So in this project, my goals are to build a workflow to extract features semi-automatically from Soviet military maps dating from the 1930s for a region of the Belarus Republic, and using the object-based image analysis approach. I will also strive to create a workflow as streamlined as possible, the reason being that to be usable in real life, such a workflow should not have too many moving parts. In the same spirit, I will assess informally the potential for real-life use. I will attempt at tackling some specific complex symbology types that I have not seen tackled in my literature review so far. So if I am successful, that would be probably my most useful contribution in this project. Finally, I would like to help assess the usefulness of OBA for historical map feature extraction. As mentioned, I found a few other examples in the literature specifically focused on using OBA for historical maps, but I have not found many of them. So it would be good to grow the body of use cases, since I believe this approach has a lot of potential. All right, we'll now switch to the project methodology, and we'll start with securing the data. So the library at Indiana University Bloomington started a collection of Soviet military maps recently, thanks to a grant. They are producing high-resolution geotiffs, and those files are not yet accessible to the public. However, I was fortunate that they gave me access to them ahead of time. Due to the nature of the collection, most of the map sheets do not form complete series. So my first challenge, as I wanted to use that collection, was to do some detective work to find a number of adjacent sheets that were from the at the same scale and more or less from the same year. On the positive side, all files are already georeferenced and cropped. So I chose 16 map sheets from a topographic series at a 1:50,000 scale. They represent the region east of Vistyets, sorry for the pronunciation, in the Belarus Republic. And they were all published in 1936 and 1937. Together, they represent an area of 72 by 60 kilometers. All rasters have 3 bands from for the colors red, green, and blue. And here you can see the 8 rasters for the bottom half of my area of interest. Here is a detail so that you have a sense of how those maps looks like. There is no legend on the maps themselves, and the map users relied on a guidebook that was published separately. I don't have the original Soviet guide, but I am using a symbolization guide that was published by the US Army in 1958, and that I found on the UC Berkeley Library website. So far, it seems to be describing my maps perfectly. Okay, we'll talk about workflow. So as mentioned, the overall approach I selected is the Object-Based Image Analysis, or OBA. The main software applications I will use are eCognition, which is a software package specialized in OBA image analysis and is usually used for analyzing remote sensing imagery. And I will also use ArcGIS Pro, which I will use most particularly for the preparatory and post-processing steps. So here is the workflow. At first, the first step is to acquire raster files, select, acquire, and verify the 16 GeoTIFF raster files, and I'm sort of midway into that. Then create a single raster datasets in ArcGIS Pro. Then the next step is to prepare the AOI raster. After performing more tests in eCognition, I will have to decide whether I want to perform any preparatory steps outside of eCognition, such as color calibrating the map sheets in Photoshop, for instance. I would rather not, since my goal is to create a workflow that is as streamlined as possible. But I will have to see if eCognition can handle any color variation from map sheet to map sheet. I will then generate a single consolidated raster in ArcGIS. And after estimating the processing time in eCognition, I might decide to proceed to downsampling the raster. This would be with the goal of achieving faster processing, but I must strike a balance to avoid losing too much information. That would also be done in ArcGIS Pro. The next step will be to define several small raster subsets. They will be used to develop and test the rule set instead of using the full raster. And this makes sure to keep the processing time low during the development phase. The subset should be carefully chosen to represent the full variety of landscape features. And eCognition, thankfully, has a functionality to facilitate the creation of subsets. I will then start developing the rule set in eCognition, alternating among the different subsets. Yeah. You can see a screenshot of how a rule set fragment looks like. The rule sets usually include rules to perform pre-processing steps, like generating interesting temporary views of the raster. the rules to segment the raster into objects. You can see here a screenshot showing a detail of my raster with the objects shown in red. And there are also many rules to classify the objects. They can use information specific to each object, such as hue, intensity, saturation, size, or length to width ratio. They can also use information about the context of each object. For instance, the type of object that it is surrounded by, the properties of those surrounding objects, or the larger scale super objects it belongs to. The illustration here shows a detail of my raster where the bright colors symbolize classes such as forest, soil, water, and contour lines. This was the result of a very simple preliminary rule set test that I developed. The arrows between pre-processing steps, segmentation, and classification denote the highly iterative nature of the process. For instance, after having done a segmentation and some classification operations, I might go back to resegment some classes with a different segmentation algorithm to obtain a more precise segmentation. I expect that there will be at least 7 to 80 rules in my rule set based on my previous experience with eCognition. When the rule set is ready, the next step is to run the rule set on the entire OAI raster. This will be a major computing process, which will probably run for several hours. It might also require several tries. The last rules of the rule set will be focused on generating shapefiles that correspond to the different classes resulting from the analysis. They will contain polygons, polylines, or points depending on the feature type. Those shapefiles will be the main output of the eCognition analysis. I will then proceed to the accuracy assessment. I will do that in ArcGIS Pro, and I will generate a point sample across the entire OAI raster, stratified by a feature type. I will then classify those points manually using human visual assessments, which will count as an approximation of ground truth. And I will then generate a confusion matrix that shows the percentage of classification errors in the sample. I will also assess the potential for using the workflow that I developed in a real-life setting. For instance, as an add-on to the Indiana University scanning project. I will do that informally based on my previous professional experience with digitization workflows in an academic library context. Finally, I will create several thematic maps to showcase the results of the analysis, and I will do that in ArcGIS Pro. So now the features targeted. In this analysis, I will focus most particularly on extracting land cover style features such as forested areas, barren land, built-up areas, and wetlands. Belarus has many wetland or swamp areas, and so it will be an important aspect of this project. Some of the challenging symbology that I expect to encounter are the built-up areas, which are black, which is the same color as labels, roads, vegetation, tree symbols, and maps. So this will be and more, which will be so this will be an interesting challenge. Also, they have variable shapes, which in many cases reproduce the actual shapes of the buildings. Another challenging symbology is the representation of wetlands or swamps, because it is a multi-layer symbology. So just to run you really quickly through it, you can see that the stripes, so like the stripes in the blue and white stripes represent swamp areas or wet areas. And then you can see also that you have different types of symbols that represent grass, moss, or reed or cane. And then what you have here in terms of the white areas is that you can see in A, there is few white areas, then more white areas, and then a lot of white areas. And what that represents is whether this area is, this entire wetland area is impassable, hard to pass, or passable, which corresponds to the military concept of going, that is how easily you could get military personnel. All right, 5 minutes, thank you. How easily you could get military personnel moving through a piece of land. So this is going to be an interesting challenge because we can see the symbology is quite complicated there. And even one level up is you have sometimes overlaps. Like in this case, this is a swampy forest or forested wetland. I'm not sure what would be the right terminology, but we can see here that we have also forest, which is represented in green, plus those little circles which represent the fact that there are trees in that area. All right. So finally, I should mention that I will not attempt at parsing the textual elements such as labels. The reason is that that would require an entirely different set of techniques such as OCR. However, I will strive to identify those elements as a separate class of e-cognition objects to avoid miscategorizing these textual elements as features. Okay, my project timeline. Oh, I'm almost done. So in May, I'm going to give the peer review presentation, which is now, finalize the map set and create a single raster and start developing the e-cognition rule sets. June, July, I will develop any pre-processing steps that might be needed, estimate the overall processing time and decide whether I'm going to downsample and proceed to the downsampling if I do it. And I will fully develop the e-cognition rule set. Still working on all of this will be done on the raster subsets. Oops, sorry. And then I will apply the rule set to the full raster in August. And this step might be quite iterative if issues are detected. And I will perform the accuracy assessment. In September, I will assess the potential for a production workflow, create illustrative maps, write the final report, and prepare the conference presentation. And in October, I will present at the conference and finalize the report. Sorry. The project deliverables are the e-cognition rule sets, any pre-processing script I create, the final output shape files, several illustrative maps, a report, and the presentation at the conference. For the conference, I have already submitted a proposal at the North American Cartographic Information Society 2019 conference in Tacoma, Washington. Okay. Almost the last. Potential further development beyond the capstone would be to try out the workflow in a production context and to apply it to a larger geographic areas as more and more map sheets from the same series become available. I will also share my results with the Indiana University staff. I would like to thank my advisor, Nathan Piekele, and as well as Michelle Dalmo and Teresa Quill at Indiana University. And I will now take questions. So I guess I'll go out of this because I need to see if there is any chat. Let's see how that works. Maybe I'll stop sharing?
Yes, just stop sharing and bring your chat back up. There's nothing in there at the minute, but...
Yes, okay. I'm seeing it.
Hi, I have a question. Here we have roads, old roads that are from the Spanish era, but that technically they're still public. So I see I see an application on this study. Can you tell us other practical applications for recognition?
Yes. So as I mentioned, I mean, there might be cases. So I'll give you just one example I read about, which was in the context of archaeology. There was like an interest to really understand as much as the evolution of a landscape, and for instance, finding older roads, etc., which maybe in the 19th century were still visible, and in the 20th century were not. And that was like a way for archaeologists, it was in Europe, to sort of detect maybe some remnants of the Roman era, for instance, that might still show in the 19th century, but not 20th century. And I'll give one more example, which is in environmental studies. So there was this a place in Africa, I'm not remembering the exact country, sorry. But basically there was this natural preserve for a type of chimpanzees, I believe. And there was like the researchers were wondering why the population had been steadily decreasing, and were trying to understand the factors that might have played. And by looking at historical maps, a variety of them, and compiling them together, they realized that in fact the area had consistently shrunk. That is, in fact, this natural preserve, even though the history had been sort of lost, by the local population, looking at the maps, they realized that in fact it had steadily decreased because pieces had been removed to repurpose for other uses. So those are two examples that I can mention. Does that help?
Yes, great. I think that last one for me is really interesting. And do you think that this methodology could be like a precursor to other methodologies or other technologies, like maybe later LiDAR data to recognize features?
So, I mean, for the map itself, you're not going to have LiDAR data, unfortunately. So unless you take modern LiDAR for an area, and you sort of, use it together with the map, which might have pros and cons, because perhaps the relief has changed. But yeah, is that, am I misunderstanding your question?
Yeah, I'm thinking that it could be a first step in maybe a longer methodology, but I'm just here brainstorming. But it's a great presentation. Thank you.
Oh, sure. And yeah, I mean, there are definitely many things that could be done, and there are huge collections that, so far have not been digitized because it just takes so long, and that's why it's interesting to find ways to try to automate. Okay, let me just quickly look at some of the chat messages. Consider is geospatial. Yeah, I know they have done a lot in general. They have specialized in Eastern type of maps. And one thing also which is interesting is like sometimes data is available from vendors, but historical data, but it's very expensive. So that's another aspect that, do we necessarily have to go through vendors? And maybe an application in defense and security. Yeah, I mean, that would not be my specialty, but certainly, I mean, some of those maps are going, in fact, until relatively recently. And, I mean, I'm sure that, non-Russian governments have looked with a lot of interest at those maps. In fact, a good illustration is that guide, that symbology guide I'm using, which was published by the US Army in 40 years ago, and I'm sure that the interest was greatly continued.
Okay, I think that's it. Thank you very much for a great presentation.
Thank you.
Our next presenter is Ben. If you can load up your presentation, please. I've just posted the link back up in the chat window so that you can provide feedback.
Okay, can you hear me and can you see my slides?
Yes, to both. So whenever you're ready, and you have 25 minutes, 5 minutes of questions. Can you see your chat window?
Yes, I
Okay, good,
can.
because I'll send you a private chat then when there's 5 minutes left.
Okay, great.
Okay, whenever you're ready.
Hi, everyone. My name is Ben Cho. My advisor for my capstone is David Goldberg. My presentation is entitled Plugging in and Charging Up, Increasing Plug-in Electric Vehicle Adoption by Residents of Multifamily Buildings in Los Angeles County. And my interest in this topic came about because I had an electric vehicle for about 2 years, which I was able to charge at work and at the gym, but I had to give it up, unfortunately, and return to a gas-powered vehicle because I lost access to reliable charging when I changed jobs. So this experience led me to explore this particular topic for my capstone project. In this presentation, I will provide an introduction of electric vehicles, including what they are, how they're charged, and California's goals as it relates to these vehicles. I will also briefly discuss previous research on this topic with an emphasis on 2 studies in the Los Angeles area. I'll explain my objectives, proposed methodology, and expected results. I will also go over a timeline for completing my analysis and presenting the final results. And finally, at the end, I will respond to any feedback or questions that you might have. An electric vehicle is a vehicle that either partially or completely relies on an electric motor for propulsion. They're also known as zero-emission vehicles in California, or ZEVs. There are 2 types of ZEVs. The first one is the fuel cell electric vehicle, which are fueled using compressed hydrogen gas. An example is the Toyota Mirai, shown here. The other example of a ZEV is much more common. It is the plug-in electric vehicle, or PEV, and they have batteries that are recharged by plugging into an electricity source. There are 2 types of PEVs. There are battery electric vehicles, or BEVs, which rely solely on an electric motor, and some examples are all of the Tesla models, as well as the Nissan Leaf and Chevy Bolt. The other type of PEV is the plug-in hybrid electric vehicle, which has both an electric motor as well as a gas engine. And perhaps the most well-known example of the plug-in hybrid is the Chevy Bolt. But there are other models from a variety of other companies, such as the Ford Fusion Energy, as well as the Kia Niro plug-in, to name just a few. I also want to point out that electric vehicles don't include traditional hybrids, so hybrids like the Toyota Prius, which do not have to be plugged in. Batteries in plug-in electric vehicles currently can be charged in one of 3 ways: from a level 1 charging outlet, which is a standard 3-prong household electrical outlet. Because they can't provide very much power, they're typically only suitable for charging in a residential setting, since it can take a long time to charge the vehicle. And the cost of installing a level 1 outlet can range from no cost, that is, if you have an outlet already installed in your garage or available on the exterior of your home, and it can range up to several $1,000s. That is, if you have an older home and you have to upgrade the electrical panel as well as install a new outlet. Level 2 charging stations supply more power than level 1, so vehicles can charge more quickly. They're common in both residential and commercial settings, and the equipment and installation costs can range from around $1,500 to nearly $20,000. The low end is more typical of a home environment where wall-mounted equipment like the photo on the left is used, and the high end is more likely in a commercial setting where networked pedestal charging stations, like the example shown on the right, are commonly installed. In these cases, the equipment is more costly because these charging units have more advanced features like digital screens and RFID readers to charge users based on their usage. And the installation costs are oftentimes higher because they can be further away from electrical panels, so they require more electrical wiring. Finally, the last way to charge a plug-in electric vehicle is through DC fast charging, which is the most powerful method. Because DC fast chargers use a high voltage supply, they're only found in commercial settings. Most can support charging at 50 kilowatts, but there are newer stations being installed right now that are capable of up to 350 kilowatts, but there are no vehicles on the market currently that can support charging at that power. The equipment and installation costs, as you can imagine, are also very high, ranging from around $14,000 to more than $50,000 per station. These charts show the charging time differences for two popular models. On the left is the Chevy Volt, which is a plug-in hybrid. Its battery allows the car to travel about 50 miles on electricity alone before the gas engine kicks in. Plug-in hybrids typically don't support DC fast charging because their batteries are small and they can be charged relatively quickly from either a level 1 or a level 2 station. And depending upon the charger installed in the Chevy Volt, the battery can be completely charged in about 2 to 4.5 hours from a level 2 station. Through a standard level 1 household outlet, it requires about 13 hours to charge the battery from empty to full. While this might seem like a long time, keep in mind that most people will not be running the battery to empty every day. And with a hybrid, there is a gas engine if you run out of charge in your battery. On the right, this is the Chevy Bolt, which is a full battery electric vehicle. It has a much larger battery that allows the car to travel nearly 240 miles on a single charge. Using a DC fast charger, the battery can be charged from empty to full in close to 1.5 hours. With level 2, it takes close to 10 hours, and with level 1, about 60 hours. Again, it's highly unlikely that someone driving this type of vehicle will be running it to empty every single day, but Chevy does recommend that Bolt drivers install a level 2 charging station, given how impractical it could be to charge with a level 1 station. There are many reasons why there is growing interest in ZEVs from both a policy and consumer perspective. They reduce fossil fuel use and therefore reduce greenhouse gas emissions, which we know cause climate change. Because there's less fossil fuel being combusted, there are also benefits for local air quality due to fewer air pollutants, so reductions in particulate matter and carbon monoxide. There is less ambient noise. Some of you may be aware that electric vehicles are so quiet that in many countries, they're being required to emit artificial noise to warn pedestrians of their presence. And from a driver's perspective, they have better performance than gas cars as it relates to acceleration and handling. And as a result, they have high driver satisfaction generally. California has a reputation for being a pioneer when it comes to sustainability and environmental initiatives, so it shouldn't be too surprising that the state has established goals for ZEV adoption. Currently, there are about 570,000 ZEVs on the roads and close to 20,000 public chargers available. By 2025, the goal is 1.5 million ZEVs and 250,000 public chargers. And by 2030, the goal is 5 million ZEVs on the roads. This might seem like a lot of vehicles, but for perspective, there are about 35 million registered vehicles in California right now. Nevertheless, the ZEV market will have to grow substantially in the next few years in order to meet these goals. From this chart, you can see how quickly sales have grown since 2011, reaching about 8% of new vehicle market share last year. And there are dozens of new models that will go on sale in the next few years from nearly every major car company. Yet there will likely be continued challenges to expanding ZEV adoption due to higher purchase prices as well as the relatively limited driving range. Although there are improvements in battery technology that are occurring rapidly, which is leading to increased capacity and also decreasing battery costs. To address some of these challenges, the state, along with regional and local public agencies, have offered a variety of financial incentives to reduce the cost of purchasing or leasing a ZEV. Perhaps most notably, the state has offered a rebate through the Clean Vehicle Rebate Project, or CVRP, for several years now. Currently, that program offers a rebate of $1,500 to $7,000 on the purchase or lease of a ZEV, depending upon the vehicle as well as your household income. Public funding also has been used to install more chargers throughout the state, and even more public chargers are being installed in recognition that charging infrastructure will be crucial to meeting the state's goals. If you'll recall from an earlier slide, there will need to be about 10 times more public chargers by 2025 than there are now. So there's a lot of public chargers that need to be added to the charging networks. There are a variety of regulatory and funding strategies being deployed. For example, recent changes to the state's mandatory Green Building Standards Code, which is known as CalGreen, require that newly constructed buildings include a specified minimum amount of parking spaces that are charging station capable. There are also public investments. The California Energy Commission has allocated about $95 million to support various charging infrastructure projects, and there are also private sector investments. There are over $1 billion in funding from electric utilities as well as through legal settlements that are being spent on public charging. Los Angeles County plays a particularly important role in achieving the state's ZEV goals. It's home to 10 million people, making it the most populous county in California as well as the United States overall. It is home to about a quarter of the state's population and currently about 20% of the ZEV market. It's estimated that to help achieve the state's 2025 ZEV goals, about 240,000 ZEVs and more than 23,000 public chargers will have to be added in LA County alone. This could be challenging due to the high proportion of households that are living in multifamily buildings, that is condominium and apartment buildings. More than 40% of county households live in these types of buildings, and contrary to the pattern perhaps seen in many other parts of the United States, these households are not necessarily low income. In fact, in some high income areas of the county, more than 75% of residential parcels are occupied by multifamily buildings, particularly apartments. Despite the rather large proportion of households living in multifamily buildings in the county, they are underrepresented when it comes to PEV adoption. Only 10% of CVRP survey respondents in the county reported living in these building types, and several studies have noted that the inability to charge at home is a significant obstacle to PEV adoption for these residents. There are some particular challenges that households living in apartments and condos face when trying to install charging stations. They may not have dedicated parking, so they rely on street parking. They also may live in buildings that have complex parking layouts that might require high costs for installing a charging station. And they also have to deal with and get approval from HOAs and landlords, which is not easy. These obstacles can be effective deterrents to driving a PEV, and for my capstone, I wanted to explore how increasing public chargers could help overcome these obstacles. I reviewed many different studies to inform my methodology, but most of them didn't address the issue of a lack of home charging. However, there were two related studies from UCLA that specifically identified multifamily buildings for charger installation. Both of these studies used a model to assign a score to multifamily parcels based on their location within a census tract, as well as the average unit value for those buildings. And the score represented the likelihood that a household living in that building would drive a PEV if home charging wasn't an obstacle. The model generally assumes that households living in higher value properties have higher incomes and are more likely to drive a PEV. But there were some issues with the model's reliance on assessed property values. These values don't necessarily reflect actual market values in many cases due to a voter initiative passed in 1978. This initiative is known as Proposition 13, and it prevents counties from changing the assessed value of properties unless there is a change in ownership or new construction. Therefore, a parcel's assessed value could be substantially below market value if it hasn't changed ownership. My methodology chooses not to use assessed property values for this specific reason. Additionally, my approach differs from these studies since I plan to focus on locations where public chargers can be installed, since they can be used by more drivers, which I think would make them more beneficial and potentially more cost-effective than chargers that are installed on-site at a multifamily building and only available for tenant use. The objectives for my capstone project are to first identify census tracts in LA County where installing public chargers could increase PEV adoption by residents of multifamily buildings, and second, to identify suitable parking facilities for charging station installation in or near these census tracts. This chart shows the general workflow for achieving the objectives, and I'll go into more detail about each of these steps in the next few slides. In part one of my project, I will calculate a PEV demand index score for each census tract in the county. I will classify those scores, and then I'll use the census tracts with the highest scores in the latter part of the project. In part two, I will select parking facilities that meet type and use criteria. I will apply criteria to find the most suitable facilities for charging station installation, and then use the output from part one to identify parking facilities in or near the highest scoring census tracts. The PEV demand index score will be based on several different variables, and the score represents the potential for PEV adoption by residents of multifamily buildings. So I expect that census tracts with, for example, more multifamily housing units, higher incomes, and higher education levels will have higher scores. The values will be normalized either using the maximum or minimum value for that variable. The variables would then be averaged and then multiplied by 100. So theoretically, these scores would then range from 0 to 100, but I don't think that there will be scores at either extreme. This table shows 7 of the 12 variables that will be used in the score calculation. The first 3 variables rely on data from the county assessor, and they relate to building type, so essentially trying to target census tracts with a high number of multifamily housing units. There's also building size in this, specifically looking at parcel density or the number of units on a parcel, with the premise that chargers in higher density areas can benefit more drivers. And they'll also be looking at building age under the assumption that older buildings are less likely to have public chargers installed because of the recent changes in building codes. The remaining 4 variables are socioeconomic variables, and I will be using data from the Census Bureau's American Community Survey. The first one is housing tenure, so the proportion of renter-occupied housing units in the census tract. Within multifamily housing occupants, renters are least likely to install charging infrastructure since they have to put out a lot of costs and they cannot oftentimes move the charging station with them when they move to a different residence. And then the remaining 3 variables are related to income, age, and education level, with the thresholds for these variables coming from CVRP survey data. So effectively comparing a census tract's demographics to the demographics of existing PEV drivers. These are the 5 remaining variables used in calculating the score. The first 3 also use the Census Bureau's ACS data, and they relate to household transportation modes. So essentially, I think that people using cars, trucks, and vans are more likely to consider adopting a PEV or purchasing or leasing a PEV, as opposed to those that are relying on public transportation or other transit methods. The number of household vehicles, there's research that shows that households that have access to more than one vehicle are more likely to consider a PEV. And commuting time, under the general assumption that shorter commute time corresponds to a shorter commute distance, which would be more appropriate given the limitations of PEV driving ranges. The last 2 variables relate to current rates of PEV adoption, as well as the current number of public chargers, with this data coming from the California Department of Motor Vehicles and the US Department of Energy. There's research that suggests that households in areas with more PEV drivers are more likely to consider a PEV, and areas with a low ratio of public chargers to registered PEVs. So that is, there are many more PEVs than there are public chargers. I think that is an opportunity to potentially install more chargers in those census tracts. I plan to use the GeoPandas Python data library to process the parcel level data. I think this would be the most efficient way to process the more than 2 million parcel records in LA County. And I plan to use ArcGIS Pro for processing the remaining data as well as the analysis. The Census Bureau data is already available at the census tract level, so I think that will require minimal prep. I will have to re-aggregate the data from the DMV on PEV registration from the zip code level to the census tract level, and I'll also have to perform a spatial join of the public charger point data to census tract polygons in order to determine the number of public chargers in each census tract. I will calculate the final scores and classify the scores using the natural breaks method into high, medium, and low categories. And for part 2, I also plan to use ArcGIS Pro for the entire analysis. This part of the project relies heavily on a polygon data set of parking lot boundaries and attributes related to how those parking lots are being used, which I was able to get access from Los Angeles County. And this table shows parking lot use types matched with charging station types based on assumptions related to how long customers generally might stay parked. So for example, since level 2 charging sessions are most beneficial if lasting an hour or more, parking lots for department stores, restaurants, shopping centers, parks, etc., are considered more appropriate for level 2 charging since customers may stay parked longer at these places. Similarly, DC fast charging sessions are typically most effective around 20 or 30 minutes in length. So these types of stations are more appropriate for places like banks, post offices, and grocery stores where people don't typically stay very long. Unfortunately, the LA County parking data set doesn't provide any detail about government-owned parcels, so I will have to spatially join those parcels with another county data set, which is the Location Management System, or LMS, which provides more detail about government facilities. So for instance, by doing this spatial join, I would then be able to determine if a parking lot is for a museum as opposed to a city hall, and then match them to the appropriate charging station type. There are some downsides to using the county's parking lot data set. It's based off 2014 aerial imagery, so it is a bit outdated, and it only contains parking lots, not parking garages, which are much more common in the most densely developed areas of the county. So for example, in downtowns and central business district areas. But it is the best no-cost data set that I could find. After identifying candidate parking lots for level 2 and DC fast chargers, I plan to use additional suitability criteria to further narrow down the parking facilities. These criteria, which you can see here, eliminate facilities with chargers already installed. They would eliminate facilities farther than 1 mile from primary or secondary roads. And they would also eliminate facilities located within the special flood hazard area, which is designated by FEMA, and it's commonly known as the 100-year floodplain. The last steps are to create buffers around census tracts with high scores. I plan to use 3 buffer distances, 1/2 mile, 2.5 miles, and 5 miles. I chose 1/2 mile since travel survey data for LA suggests that that's the average distance traveled when people are walking for shopping or errand trips. 5 miles since that same survey data suggests that's the average distance traveled when using a vehicle for errands. And I chose 2.5 miles since that is an intermediate distance. Finally, I will intersect the buffers with the parking lots meeting the suitability criteria and get my results. In terms of the expected results from part 1, I expect to have census tracts in the county categorized by potential for increasing PEV adoption by multifamily residents. And from part 2, that will result in lists of candidate facilities for level 2 and DC fast charger installation in or near census tracts with high potential for PEV adoption. Ideally, these results would be presented in a web application, but that will largely depend on how much time I have after finishing my analysis. So in terms of my timeline for completing my capstone, I expect to finalize my proposal and begin on part 1 of the analysis this month and complete part 1 by the end of June. I plan to begin and finish part 2 in July and start working on my final paper in August. And in September, my goal is to finish the paper and develop my final presentation, with a final presentation at one of 3 conferences in October or November. So that's some information about my capstone project. Thanks for watching my presentation, and I'd be happy now to respond to any feedback or answer any questions that you might have. So there's a question about whether or not the methodology could be applied to other cities. I think that's my goal, that by trying to test it out and figure out if it works for LA County, that assuming that similar data is available, that it could be used in other places in California as well as across the United States.
Everyone's gone very quiet. Does anyone have more questions for Ben? I don't see any other questions coming up, Ben. A very useful project, though, and I really am curious to see what you find, and hopefully in your, Los Angeles County, they'll be able to find this useful too.
Yeah, I'm excited about getting started on it. Thanks for me.
Yeah. Great. Thank you very much. Okay, our next presenter is Jackie. If you can load your presentation, please.
See that?
I can't see anything yet.
My apologies.
That's okay.
No. Let me see what we have here.
Yes, now I see something. Yep.
All right, we look good there?
Yep, perfect. So whenever you're ready, go for it. Can you see your chat window? No, if not, don't worry. I'll do a little twinkle sound when you have 5 minutes left.
All right, well, I appreciate that. Thank
Okay.
you.
Okay.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining me. This project is about reducing operational overhead by optimally siting facilities within a service territory. I'm Jackie Sinclair, and my advisor is Michelle Zeiders. Project motivation. I've been employed with SMPA for 13 years and look for opportunities to support business objectives with the use of GIS. The GIS has historically been underutilized at the cooperative, and its capabilities have not generally been well understood by decision makers. Many organizational changes have resulted in the recent purchase of an enterprise solution for integrating customer information, billing, asset management, outage management, and GIS. GIS is now a central and highly visible aspect of the integrated system, and this project was suggested by SMPA management to help reduce operational overhead costs. SMPA is a small rural electric distribution cooperative located in Southwest Colorado, serving approximately 13,500 consumer members and consisting of parts of 7 rural counties. Much of the terrain is mountainous and remote. The regional topography can cause long travel times to service locations, particularly when accessed over dirt and gravel roads. Several of the consumer communities experience fluctuating populations due to prevalent tourism, specifically Silverton, Telluride, and Mountain Village. This results in high account turnover or changes in the status of active services requiring meter access by SMPA operations personnel to disconnect and reconnect service. Furthermore, travel to some locations is often complicated by weather, affecting road and terrain conditions, which can pose safety issues for the linemen. Here's an idea of the terrain in our territory. The photo in the lower right is on the west end and shows the dichotomy of the landscape. The project study has been restricted to the service territory boundary in order to maintain a consistent geographic extent for analysis. Some organizational agreements exist for providing power to sites outside of the territory boundary. These locations may be further evaluated on a case-by-case basis. The service territory is divided among 4 service areas. Each service area has a central office location for staff, crews, and equipment. The service areas delineate crew operational responsibilities, essentially partitioning the territory into 4 distinct work areas. Most of these will be familiar to you, but I want to point out that you'll be hearing SD meters a lot. Those are service disconnect meters. I will also be using service location or service point and meter location interchangeably in reference to the physical location where a consumer connects to the electrical distribution system. The primary purpose and goal of the project is to optimally site service disconnect meters at existing service locations. SD meters have additional functionality over typical meters in that office personnel have the ability to remotely disconnect and reconnect service at the site location. The cost of SD meters is prohibitive for system-wide deployment. Identifying the most optimal installation sites conserves the cooperative's investment. SD meters provide benefits of saving money on skilled man hours and travel costs while improving customer service with quicker reconnect times. The use of SD meters also mitigates extended and sometimes hazardous travel to and from service locations and spares administrative time for coordinating, scheduling, and dispatching linemen to manually perform disconnect and reconnect services. The project objectives include identifying SD meter candidates using customer account data. This is based on qualitative customer criteria and meter information that have been defined by SMPA management. SD meter candidates will also be identified based on access constraints. These may be service locations that are remote, difficult to access due to poor road conditions, or where travel is impeded due to seasonal or hazardous conditions. The project essentially consists of a 2-fold analysis to determine a final but distinct set of locations that are candidate for SD meter exchange. The first analysis will be querying the CIS to isolate accounts that meet the specific criteria for SD installation and mapping them. Criteria include high turnover service locations, those that experience frequent disconnect and reconnect activity. These might be seasonal locations that annually disconnect due to inactivity and are typically remote service locations, rentals where account ownership often changes, requiring the meter to be inactive for a short duration, disconnect for non-payment accounts. The number of disconnects within the last year and the customer's credit history will be captured for later evaluation. Other exclusionary criteria from the CIS data are current opt-out accounts. This is where customers have opted to incur a monthly surcharge to avoid having automated meter reading equipment installed. Any non-compatible services, meters must be of a certain type for the collar to accommodate an SD meter for exchange, and any current SD meter locations. A geographic analysis of the service territory to model factors that impact the accessibility of existing services will identify the remaining candidate SD meter locations. Component GIS data consists of road network and with surface type attributes to assess distances and accessibility from office locations to meter locations within a given service region. Other geographic data pertinent to the analysis are the slope of the terrain, seasonal precipitation and snowfall accumulation data, as well as any known hazard areas. These include flood sites, landslide areas, and avalanche paths. The purpose of my literature review was to gain insight on the use of GIS for accessibility studies and siting facilities. I looked for literature that might answer questions about the most appropriate software and methods used, how multi-criteria decision evaluation applies within a GIS, and any insights that might be gained in previous industry-related cost surface analysis projects. Previous work pointed to the effectiveness of GIS-based approaches for performing cost surface analysis and evaluating accessibility models and providing what were regarded as more optimal results. Prevalent methodology for developing and analyzing cost surfaces involved merging isolated impedances or criteria into one accumulated friction surface. This requires converting data to raster for analysis, performing kriging to interpolate point-based spatiotemporal values such as precipitation, and creating a least cost path from a source to a destination to identify routes of least resistance over the friction surface as an evaluative measure of accessibility. It was clear in the reading that the complexity of cost surface and data requirements are driven by project goals. Goals, in turn, define the selection parameters, criteria, and methodologies. Creating cost surfaces with consideration to a project's purpose helps to clarify data requirements, the analysis process, and reasoning for chosen methods. The use of multi-criteria and GIS for solution-oriented decision-making comes into play when analyzing a range of geographic problems like modeling movement across a surface, suitability analysis, and optimally siting facilities. GIS platforms provide an effective and accurate way to derive repeatable results with mechanisms for optimizing those results using localized criteria parameters, weighting and ranking factors. There are no hard and fast rules regarding calibrating criteria, but the reasoning and values should be documented as part of the analysis process and consistent among features. Previous work in the electric industry demonstrates the capacity of GIS for providing solutions to industry-related problems. Cost surface analysis has been used to optimally route power lines and estimate the cost of providing power to specific locations. A comprehensive view of all the related tables and attributes that have been extracted from the CIS to participate in the criteria selection is shown here in an entity relationship diagram. The scale and depth of the customer data analysis can be appreciated in this overview, where the large arrows represent process query activities and the table relationships are mapped using black arrows. As an aside, thank God for Geography 868. The required CIS tables to perform the customer data queries using aforementioned criteria are shown in this summary table. Tables with customer identifier information, credit history, account and service order activities, and meter types are extracted from the Oracle CIS database in full. Listed tables have been brought into MS Access and joined using the field keys in column 3. Since one customer can have multiple accounts, compound keys were necessary in some instances to maintain a one-to-one relationship during the join process and review all the customer accounts. Table color coding represents groups of CIS tables that were initially joined for query or series of selection statements and result in pared down tables containing attributes that satisfy the criteria. The initial query tables were subsequently joined in a final inquiry to produce a list of meter locations meeting all the account criteria. Important identifier and descriptive information was retained along with location XYs. Locations have been mapped for eventual use in a field installation tracking application. An example of one of the queries is shown in the background graphic, illustrating how lengthy the selection statements were. This process was validated by SMPA's Information Technology Manager for query construction integrity and assurance that accounts within the resulting selection set met the customer criteria. The customer analysis revealed 457 service locations that are candidate for SD meter exchange. These locations will be reviewed to ensure that accounts are still active and have not had an SD meter installed during the course of this project. Target meters will be scheduled for prioritization upon project completion. The data for cost surface analysis has been collected and is shown here. The 30-meter DEM will be used to generate a slope surface. Road data with surface types will be integrated into a final road network for use in distance and cost distance analysis from office locations to service points. The remaining data represent other seasonal access impedances and will be accounted for in summer and winter models. Seasonal average point precipitation data will be interpolated for use in the summer and winter models along with flood sites, landslide areas, and avalanche paths. SMPA GIS data is not shown on this list and is comprised of the SMPA service territory boundary, service regions, office locations, and current active service points. The current the current data for the study have been co-registered and clipped or masked. The slope surface was created and will be reclassified according to the slope degree shown in the top right inset map. Preliminary rasterization of the road network for cost distance analysis revealed that roads had been insufficiently represented, shown in the inset in the lower right. I will need to gather county GIS road data and add any missing available roads, consulting aerial imagery to categorize the surface type. 47% of the average precipitation occurs during the winter months and early spring. 53% of the average precipitation falls within late spring and early fall, with a peak of 23% of the total occurring in August and September. 84% of the average snow accumulation occurs during the winter months, with peak accumulation occurring in late spring. 2018 was a drought year, but contains far more regional gauge station points than were available in the normals data sets provided by NOAA. Monthly averages were only available up to 2010. After review, I've determined to revisit the available data and try to retrieve more current regional values to calculate seasonal averages. Seasonal average point precipitation data will be interpolated using kriging for use in the summer model, along with flood sites and landslide areas. Seasonal average snow accumulation data points will be interpolated using kriging for use in the winter model with avalanche paths. The data is provided in CSV format and requires a good deal of reformatting. Cost surface analysis, feature weights, and ranking. The roads and slope data have been consistently ranked and weighted among the two cost surface models. Road surface types will have a significant impact on crews being able to access service locations, as will slope, and have been given the lion's share of the weight factor as shown in column 4. Summer model features include precipitation, flood sites, and landslide areas. Winter model features include snowfall accumulation and avalanche areas. All data will be converted to raster using conversion or spatial analyst tools, including surface slope and kriging for precipitation and snow data. These data will be reclassified according to the friction ranks. Road data with surface types will need to be recombined into a final raster to retain ranks among the differing surface types, greatly affecting the ease of travel. 2 seasonal models will be created with the use of weighted overlay, combining the participating raster layers. Cost distance will be run on the seasonal models for each service region and corresponding office location to reveal the accumulated cost for each cell from the office. Evaluating the final seasonal cost surfaces to identify candidate SD locations will be a visual inspection as I explore options for quantifying corresponding cost values to each of the 13,500 service locations. Preliminary results of the summer model are shown here as a proof of concept. The product of kriging the average precipitation data are displayed before reclassification. The weighted overlay contains the reclassified slope, roads, landslides, and flood sites with the percent influence discussed previously. The final cost distance raster with service points shown in white is displayed on the right. The average snow accumulation data have been processed with Kriging and are displayed before reclassification. The weighted overlay contains the additional reclassified avalanche path data, slope and road network rasters according to the weights provided in the earlier table. The final cost distance raster with service points shown in white is displayed on the right. The summer and winter cost distance models are very similar, and I would expect a greater variation once the more dense precipitation and snowfall data points are collected from NOAA and processed. After review of the preliminary analysis, I believe the results will be more meaningful if the cost distance was run at the geoprocessing extent of each individual region and its corresponding office location. I expect that the bulk of the service locations identified for SD Exchange will be the result of the CIS analysis. Duplicate identification of service locations is also expected between the customer queries and spatial analysis process. This is due to the fact that some customer criteria regarding disconnect frequency are a function of being remote account locations. Duplicate service locations identified through the CIS and cost surface analysis processes will be removed from the GIS selection set. The service locations that are selected using geographic analysis will be reviewed by operations personnel to ensure that meters under consideration for an SD upgrade are of a reasonable quality or quantity, and that exchange locations are warranted. Upon the completion of the final analysis and before SD meter installation occurs, targeted locations will be cross-checked with the current customer account status and meter information to ensure that accounts are still active and have not had an SD meter installed during the course of the project. It is likely that locations will be prioritized for scheduling meter exchanges. It's important to note that the project deliverables are for SMPA consumption only. No consumer data will be shared externally as a result of this project. The project timeline is shown here with a final analysis to be completed within the next month. The hope is that I will be presenting at GIS in the Rockies in the fall. Here's a list of the rest of my current references. And that about sums it up. Any questions?
Any questions? Jackie, can you see your chat window?
I cannot. I am looking and I am.
You might have to stop sharing and then scroll down.
Oh, thank you. Okay, scrolling. Well, how I'm dealing with maintaining the privacy is I'm not sharing any. There'll be no final deliverable outputs that associates anybody's name, account number, or anything about the customer information. It'll strictly be a generalized map of service locations that were identified, and any of the actual deliverables will be delivered to internally to the SMPA staff, which everyone is obviously very, well, we're all authorized to view that information.
Are there any other questions? I think everyone has gone to lunch.
Okay, well, you know, you can't blame them.
I do have one other question.
Sure.
What are some of the challenges that you think, because you've got lots of different data that you're pulling together, so what do you think is some of the challenges of doing that?
Well, I think, you know, just from doing the dry run on the service territory wide, it was definitely, I think the challenges are the precipitation, point data. You know, there were very few gauge sites that had information, and that I think detracts from, you know, a more realistic friction surface. Secondly, the road network information, the county data doesn't contain surface type information. So having to go through and select all that and bring that over, that's going to be a time consuming process in itself. And also, I think some of the challenges I'm running into is just in a weighted overlay. I'm not that familiar with that tool, and in doing this, I see that the scales, you know, I made certain assumptions at the beginning about what the scales might be, and when you get it to the weighted overlay process, there are some restrictions. So I think it's going to take a little bit of work on my part to try to get the most accurate, realistic representation of the data being used.
But it sounds like you're working through it in a systematic way, which is great.
Yeah,
thanks. Yeah, those weighted overlays are always the most challenging because it's the analyst bias and figuring out what is capturing what you're supposed to be doing. Yeah,
exactly. And the other thing that I didn't really anticipate was, you know, in doing those least cost paths, it's one source, one destination. So to have the 13,500 service locations, you know, distributed throughout the territory to try to get a really good and accurate measure of the cost distance has been kind of interesting to get my head wrapped around.
Yes. Well, you certainly got your work cut out for you there. So
yes.
Good luck with your project. It looks worthwhile. So
well, thank you.
And look forward to seeing the end results.
Appreciate that. Thank you. Have a great day.
You too.
Okay. Bye.
Okay, our final presenter, Nadia. Excellent. So whenever you're ready.
Yeah, I can hear everyone's tummies grumbling, so.
Yes. Can you see your chat window?
I would appreciate the dingle at the 5-minute mark.
Okay, I will do that. Whenever you're ready, go for it.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Nadia Kyra, and I'm going to be sharing my capstone update with you. I'm an exploration geologist, hence my interest in modeling copper potential. The title of the talk, which I might reconsider because it's very long, is Modeling Copper Potential Using a Desktop GIS and Esri's Web GIS Suitability Modeler widget, an example from the Southwest Porphyry Copper Province of the United States and Mexico. So a bit of a presentation outline. I'll be basically discussing what mineral potential mapping is, why one would want to do it. I'll give you a slide on the state of the research, present the study area, a bit of a project workflow, and I'd like to discuss the geological model I've chosen. It's a porphyry copper model and why I've chosen it. I'll discuss the modeling approach. I'm going to use an overlay analysis tool, although I'll present also some of the available overlay analysis tools a bit. I thought that was useful. I'm going to be doing a multi-criteria index overlay using two different modeling environments, the ArcGIS desktop GIS using weighted raster overlay, and in a WebGIS environment in Web App Builder that also uses a weighted raster overlay in the Suitability Modeler widget. And then I'll discuss how I plan on evaluating my models, some expected outcomes, limitations, and potential future work. So I thought it would be useful to basically present the 4 stages in mineral exploration. It's basically area selection, target generation, resource evaluation, reserve evaluation. So the focus of the capstone will really be on the area selection, target generation stage. So in area selection, you decide on the mineral you're seeking, you choose your appropriate geological model, you might have an idea on permissive regions, and you might also have knowledge of a particular area. Target generation, you can do at any scale really, continent to local scale. You would integrate your data sets, decide on, basically define your anomalies, and then you decide on which significant anomalies are worthy of actually field follow-up. And then if you're lucky, you'll get to the resource evaluation stage where you estimate the grade and tonnage. If it was a copper project, the grade might be 1% in a billion tons. You would get to this stage by systematic drilling and a lot of money, at which point you'd come up with a mineral resource classification where you can really fairly confidently estimate where the mineral is and what grade it is in 3D. And if you're really lucky, you can actually mine at a profit, which is your ore reserve classification stage. So why map copper potential? Well, I think we all know the population is growing in the world and mineral consumption is increasing. And thanks to Ben's talk, I don't have to tell you what these acronyms mean, but basically in the any electric vehicle, it varies from 85 pounds of copper up to the battery operated vehicles that have up to 183 pounds of copper, so we still need copper. Third world countries do rely on their mineral resources to basically get a better life. That is definite. I also feel that we need more guidance for the mineral exploration teams and also to guide stakeholders. I'm going to propose to develop a web app that will be available to stakeholders for use, basically to enhance discoverability worldwide. So this is just basically an example of a mineral potential mapping scenario. I've chosen 6 data sets. You can see it's the continent of Africa. And basically, for mineral potential mapping, you would combine or integrate these data sets, usually from multiple sources. You would choose specific predictive criteria, let's say for copper. You might weight those criteria if you're doing your weighted raster overlay, which we'll talk about, but you can basically do this analysis using a variety of different methods. And basically combine, and you can basically do data-driven or knowledge-driven approach, which I'm going to explain in a minute. So mineral potential GIS layer layout. So this is a real-world case, which I really quite like this image. And you could see that this particular researcher has combined a series of layers, their various formats, various features in point, polygon, polyline format. And they've basically used the perspective area that's defined by already known mine locations as a proxy for their model. And they've combined these various layers ultimately to produce a final mineral potential map on the very bottom layer. I'm going to get my pointer going here because those are really quite cool. So this bottom layer here would be the goal of the analysis. And you can see over and above the already known perspective area, this researcher has picked out 3 different new exploration target areas to follow up on. So this is basically a mind map of the state of the mineral potential mapping really from 1980s, mid-80s up to present time. So up in the upper right, the early contributors in green were mapping mineral potential, or really GIS mapping land use. Some of them used, were playing around with cartographic modeling. And it wasn't until kind of the mid-90s that specific researchers started really modeling and integrating geological-centered data sets into mineral potential mapping. And then from 2000 to about 2010, Carranza and all his associates really started to define mineral potential mapping. And he basically focused on what we call knowledge-driven modeling, and in purple, and actually in this area here, and then data-driven modeling in red. And basically knowledge-driven approaches are used in frontier or really poorly explored areas around the world where there's really few mineral deposits known. And then data-driven modeling on the bottom is used in more, we call them brownfields exploration areas, where there's a high likelihood to find the mineral of interest that you're looking for. So the researchers on the left, starting from about 2012, started to apply these knowledge and data-driven model approaches. Some of them actually built, they're private, but tools by integrating all geoscience data sets, but they're private. And then others use specific commodity types for some of the tools. Random forest algorithm, and Carranza again came in, and that algorithm's been known for years, but he actually applied it and rewrote it to apply for mineral potential mapping. And then Lee basically was one of my favorite papers. He developed a tool to map resource prospectivity for China. So I've thrown in my own little research here where I plan on modeling mineral potential using a desktop GIS as well as Esri's web app builder. So I feel it's now time to tell you what a porphyry copper model is. So it's a geological model. It's actually the most sought after model in the world because it is a large tonnage, low grade deposit that goes on for sometimes 25, 30 years. They're usually found along subduction zones, so you can actually almost predict them. If you can imagine the Ring of Fire, which basically goes from the south tip of South America all the way up through West US, on through Canada, and around the rim into Japan and down into the Philippines, on into Indonesia. Copper is found in porphyry belts, which are these, it's basically a texture of a rock. I'm going to put you over to the image here, a type of rock that actually makes its way nearer to the surface and usually has copper in it. And they typically come in at around 15 per 100 square kilometers. So you can sort of maybe predict them, and they're usually at unique structural intersections. So here's my proposed study area. It covers about 1 million square kilometers. It covers southeastern Arizona, southern New Mexico, and the northern part of both Sonora and Chihuahua in Mexico. The image on the right, I've pulled in actually into Web App Builder, which I'll talk about in a minute, a world database I have for copper deposits. And you can see that there's kind of a missing gap in particular in Chihuahua, northern Chihuahua, but also in Texas and in southern New Mexico. So this is the reason why I chose this study area. So my project workflow, I feel I've already defined my, my project. I've basically got my content method and some of my results I'll present to you, expected results. Data management, I've started selecting, importing, and that's about where I've got to. I'm still downloading data sets, and I'll discuss to you some of the challenges I'm running into for that. And then I'm going to be launching a desktop GIS using ArcGIS. I'm going to use the weighted raster overlay tool in Spatial Analyst, at which point I'll have my model design already set up. I'll implement, and there's going to be a large trial and error period where I have to recalibrate the model and rerun. And then I will launch into actually building or using a web GIS and actually build an app in Web App Builder. I'll have to configure the widgets, and we'll talk about that in a minute, implement, and then again, it'll be a trial and error period. Then I'll evaluate my model, and I plan on doing a field visit and also doing a web app use case scenario. So I just threw this image in yesterday, data modeling techniques. I thought I should kind of remind everyone some of the modeling techniques that are out there, because you'll hear me refer to knowledge-driven. And there are some of the more common data modeling techniques. Many are mathematical, qualitative, quantitative, Data-driven, which, as I mentioned, are in areas of known mineral deposits, and knowledge-driven is where you throw your ideas together on, let's say, copper criteria that might lead you to a particular area. So in any kind of model, data integration is always challenging. So I don't really expect you to read the image on the left. It's my table of copper prospectivity criteria I have highlighted, and there's going to be many more, I know. Some of the source layers, I'm getting a lot from USGS, also from the Mexican state government, also some US state geological offices. So for any kind of data integration, the data extent is going to vary, in particular because I've got a large area and I'm going across country boundaries, which will be interesting. Spatial resolution, I'm expecting to have to play around with raster cell sizes. Quality and accuracy could vary across country, although I'm not sure on that. The temporal resolution, I'm expecting some of these data sets to be somewhat out of date, but I'll just have to consider that in the modeling. And then privacy, confidentiality is always a concern when you're using other people's data. So the first model environment I'm going to use is a desktop GIS. I'm going to use ArcGIS Spatial Analyst, one of the tools there. We all know there's many spatial analyst tools, and there's many knowledge-driven spatial analyst tools, which I might play around with at the end if I have time. You can develop, as we all know, very detailed analytical models. Some of the data-driven tools are the deep learning, trained data, random tree classifier, and some of the knowledge-driven tools are interpolation, and the one I'm interested in is overlay. So what are the overlay analysis tools in ArcGIS? The top 4, and these are as they pertain to multi-criteria spatial modeling problem solving. So fuzzy membership, I love that name, but you basically fuzzify or fuzzification of your evidential, say, copper criteria data into a binary presentation, but it's a sliding scale to accommodate for your unsure boundaries, and the scale would be from 0 to 1, so you'd also have 0.2, 0.5 as one of the members. A fuzzy raster overlay tool where you actually take your fuzzy membership and you apply it to a complex overlay method. The weighted raster sum tool, which I'm also interested in, but I've decided on the final overlay raster tool, and I'll explain to you why in a minute. The sum tool, you basically weight and sum multiple input rasters. You can use both floating point and integer data, which could come in handy. And then the tool I'm going to use, and I'll tell you why in a minute, the weighted raster overlay, where you reclass all your rasters into a common evaluation scale, and you rate your output, in my case, copper prospectivity. So my model environment, second model environment is I'm going to do a WebGIS, I'm going to build a web app in Web App Builder. Obviously, the advantage to a WebGIS, it extends the reach of your desktop GIS and easy shareability. You have quick access to information, lower cost, and actually not much expertise involved. The Web App Builder, I mean, there's many ways to build an app in ArcGIS Online with no programming, but the Web App Builder has incredible functionality from what I've found out of just the advantages of a web app. Obviously cross-platform, you can use it on any screen size. You can cater the app to suit your model need, and you can configure your widgets. The widgets, there's at least 30 in Web App Builder, but there's an additional, I think up to 67, that you can actually download to both your Web App Builder or your web app, which I'm finding quite handy. I'm going to be focusing on one of the widgets called the Suitability Modeler widget, and just consider substituting suitability for copper prospectivity. So what is a weighted raster overlay? This is an example of a weighted overlay that was done in desktop GIS. This particular researcher has chosen, let's say in this instance, 4 different rasters. There are lithology, alteration, faults, and geochemistry. They've got different scales for highly prospective in red to poorly prospective in blue. And you basically would combine these rasters into a common scale. And in this case, he used from 0 to 1 with all sorts of in-between ranges For a final outcome, I'm saying copper prospectivity. I can't remember the element he was modeling here, but anyway, the areas in red are highly prospective for copper, and the areas in blue might be poorly prospective or devoid of copper. So this is a weighted raster overlay model I created for another project. It just has 4 input rasters. I chose my copper prospectivity inputs that maybe a team of geologists would end up kind of agreeing on. There's a variety of processing tools I'll need to use. Euclidean distance, I'm going to want to know how far to each fault. Obviously, closer to a fault might be more important to weight. And then I would reclassify all of my input rasters, and I'm going to have many, into a common really copper favorability or mineral potential classes. So that really 10 means the same in all rasters. 10 would be highly prospective for copper and 1 would be poorly prospective. You combine them all after you weight them by importance, and that's where you start to render and recalibrate your model for a single rated output map. So some of the web app key requirements I've come up with, I'm going to want a real and obviously easy, intuitive user interface. I want to be able to store and manage the data in a spatial database. Well, the web app builder already does that. I would like to be able to accommodate for really a variety of data types, because geology data sets, geology centered data is in every different type of format you can imagine. And I'm very excited about the visualization tools. The instant visualization tools that I can use in the chart widget, for example. I'm going to consider the color considerations for the visualizations, and you basically need to be able to adjust your weight easily, which Suitability Modeler widget does. And I'd like support for web browser and display settings. That's critical. And of course, the configurable widgets is where the fun starts. So this is what I call a failed model, but I just did it very quickly in the web app builder. I named my title. I called it Mapping Mineral Potential, Finding Copper. And I only used the global databases that are available in the web app builder. And I'll be uploading all sorts of my own databases that I feel are more appropriate for my study area. But you can see this, after I played around with weighting the global lithology layer with the landforms, globe color, and elevation. Really, this model, the orange areas should be highly prospective, yet there's a lot of copper deposits in the yellow areas. So it really, I wasn't very successful in, in doing this model at this point. The types of widgets I want to talk to quickly. The types of widgets are, there's default widgets like the home widget, there's data-dependent widgets like the Suitability Modeler widget, the chart widget, and the query widget. And then there's data-independent widgets like Basemap and Bookmark, which we might all be familiar with. So here's a successful Suitability Modeler model done in using the weighted raster overlay model. Basically, the areas in green show low suitability for the particular attribute you're interested in. The areas in red show high suitability or high prospectivity. And this is an example of the chart widget where you can instantly chart your results and really dig into, basically see the distribution of your, in my case, copper prospective areas. So I'm going to do, as I mentioned, a use case scenario for the web app tool, finding copper. Basically, as you know, when you're assessing any app, it's either successful or not. But within the successful side, over on the left, there might be good and bad features. So my user experience might have been good, but perhaps the person or the user couldn't print a map from the app. If it was a poor experience or unsuccessful experience, the user might have been able to connect to the web browser to use the app, but perhaps they didn't understand how to navigate the app. So I'm going to assess both comparatively, qualitatively and quantitatively, the results of the desktop GIS and web GIS. Were new targets identified? Was new information extracted? I'd like to do area calculations on the various classes in both model environments, and accuracy. I'd like to do a field visit, at least on a subset of the data set. So my expected results, obviously, I still think I'm going to have better results in the desktop GIS. I think it's going to be easier to adjust the model. I think it's going to be able to accommodate more data types. And I do know there's more spatial analyst tools that are knowledge driven for mineral potential mapping. So I might, if I have time, play around with those. The disadvantages, obviously, map shareability, expertise required, and very much more time consuming. So I'll be playing around maybe with fuzzy logic and weighted sum just as a check. Expected results for the web app, basically advantages, global reach, shareability to everyone is wonderful. Good cross-platform capability, analytics. Disadvantages might be it only uses the single analysis method in the suitability modeler widget. That's going to be a limitation, I think, but maybe not. Maybe it's good enough. And I basically, in the future, if I'm not happy with results, I might build a tool for copper potential mapping. So my project workflow timeline, you've already seen this image, but basically I feel like I've already done for this left column, I'm already partway through my data management. And I'll be July, August, starting on my model design, where I implement the model, trial and error, and then into September, October, where I'll be building the app. And evaluation and field visit shouldn't be hard because it's an easy area to get to. And my final presentation. So I've applied or uploaded my abstract to 4 of the Esri conferences in Canada, and I'm hoping one sticks. And that's it. Thank you. Questions?
Questions, anyone? Come on, it's the last presentation. Or you can definitely go off for lunch.
No questions.
Oh, you got one. You got some.
I have one. So I was thinking this is a highly technical information, and the use of a web app builder at the end to provide users with the information is, I think, is really important. Do you think decision makers, executives, or other people within organizations in the industry is your target group, or maybe communities that want to know or participate of public consideration of new projects?
Yeah, I absolutely want to reach both exploration teams and stakeholders, because I was sharing with Ryan Baxter, my advisor, who, thank you, by the way. Basically, when I'm in Mexico, I get all these just Mexican locals bringing their rocks to me, and I just think we need to start helping people find things in their backyard. So that's one of the goals. Yes. Desktop Pro. So hi, Nadia. For the analysis in the desktop or Pro, what licenses and authorizations required to produce all outputs? Yes, full access, gold-plated ArcGIS desktop, whatever the advanced is, because I really need spatial analyst. Yeah. Did you incorporate any no development zones? Oh yes, those will be in there. You got it. Yes, I have a layer for absolutely. Absolutely. Those are the first layer we bring in, believe it or not, as geologists. I know everyone finds that hard to believe, but it's true.
I think that's it. Thank you very much, everybody. Great presentations. And we have one more set of presenters tomorrow evening. So we'll see many of you back online again tomorrow evening. And on that note, have a good rest of your day.
Bye-bye. Thank you.